So, Audrey, how are you feeling after those two presentations?
Well, that's pretty exciting.
Inspired, right?
It is. It's very inspiring.
So, I mean, I guess hearing Anne-Marie's call around ambition, but then also looking at that sort of worked case study that Stephanie's just provided us with, what do you think the implications are of the experience in Esperance for the transition that we're working through across the rest of Australia?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, thank you, both of you. And Amy and I happen to serve on the Rocky Mountain Institute board together, so which is my honor. But look, there's a few lessons, and I feel like this is continuously reinforced. One is, it's not a technology issue. I think that we've heard that technology, it's not that technology is not happening. There's an incredible amount of innovation in technology that's occurring, but it's never going to be the problem for us to get there. I think, as I sort of think about it, one is you have to have the right policy. Stephanie has the opportunity, as Horizon is not a regulated utility, so they're able to do the right things for their customers, as we know that we have a lot of constraints in terms of how policy, what people can do, and so I think the first part is policy. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about and is, when we did electrification in the US, there's my favorite story is Roosevelt was looking around and said, 80% of people who live in urban core have access to electricity, but only 20% of rural America has access. And we wanted to make it a universal right. And so one of the things he did is he created an agency that was focused on providing access to electricity on a universal basis in rural America. I think what we're learning is the studies from Rocky Mountain Institute, the examples of Stephanie, is that electrification actually has the same type of value and universal benefit as access to electricity. So it may be time to actually shift our policy focus and say it's not just actually access to electricity that matters, it's access to electrification that matters. Because out of that sort of shift, you can start then saying, well, what are the regulatory practices and what other investments and how do we scale it? But until when we talk about mindset change that view and say it's not just access to electricity, but it's actually access to how electricity is produced and consumed, or energy is produced and consumed, that we can actually then start looking at what are the systematic changes that need to be made across the line.
It's so like a services perspective. What are the energy services that are being delivered?
Well, and then it changes is what is energy services, how do you calculate benefit, because you start looking at, well, it's the total energy bill. So it has those things. So I think that's one takeaway. The second is regulatory policy. We really do need, and in the US is much more so than in Australia, but the capital bias still exists. We have to move away from that. We have to start looking at energy efficiency. Something we did in New York was to really focus on the fact that it's the bill that matters, and that the role of the utility is to help make the bill efficient. And the third is looking at business models. So we have certain changes that I think we should be thinking about, because I think we do get stuck in thinking that we're just going to be driving the horse when in fact we want to be on the car. And the part of it is, like, for example, some examples that I get excited about, in addition to what we've heard about, like, for example, Vermont utility decided that actually it's going to be a lot cheaper for them to put batteries and solar in than continuing to serve on distribution lines, because it's a very cold climate. So they moved in that direction. In California, the governor, and we've done some bad things in California, but the governor did one thing, is he required all new homes to have solar and EV. So all new homes in California are solar ready, which has been a huge boon to the solar market there. Without incentives, it's just a new standard. The third piece is new technology innovation. So for example, one of the companies that is here, Landis & Gyr, is working with a smart panel provider in Australia, or in US, called SPAN. And what they're doing, what they have is they have a proposal or a program where they can interconnect the smart meter with the home panel to make the home electrification ready. But what's most important, because the utilities in the US are really fussing around EVs and load control, both at a peak and a minimum level, it can control it in the home, because as Amory's saying, there's a huge amount of capacity in the home to shift usage. So you don't have to worry about transformers blowing or systems blowing. And so what that does, it just requires the utilities to say, our job is not just to put in the meter, but to really make the home electric ready. And then I think the last piece is, as Stephanie was talking about, we have to start talking about how do we do best practice transfer. It's not easy. Changing mindsets will be difficult. But I feel like the slides that we look at RMI is once it starts moving, as Amory said, it's going to be a lot faster. It's just that we need to have those good examples of where we really change communities around. So that's my little takeaway,
building
summary.
that early momentum. Just to dig into that piece around, who's kind of driving this transformation? And I guess there's a lot of conversation in Australia about the role of networks in this space. Like, putting aside how we've structured our regulatory markets at the moment and the constraints that currently sit around them, retailers versus networks, other players, do you have views on kind of, who's best placed to kind of engage in that, from a business model perspective, engage in that conversation with customers?
Sure. I mean, obviously, you've never heard me not to have views, whether they're correct or not. That always remains to be seen. But I think there are two pieces. One is certainly consumers are having, and we're seeing that in parts of the world where consumers are moving and much faster. We saw it here. I mean, to me, I use the example of Australia all the time. When I got here in 2017, we had about 100,000 solar installations. When I left, we had over 3 million. And I think the mindset, and this is what I explain to people outside of Australia, is that it stopped being some sort of identity thing. It started being like owning a car. I have car, I have solar. And that shift occurred really quickly. So I think part of it was innovative pricing, but then it was just the adoption rate, and then people started to see. I would have conversations with people, who were telling me that I was horrible around what I thought about the end of coal in Australia, but then they would tell me how they have solar on the roof, and they were very proud of it. So that was so I think that shift, but then I think the utilities have a huge role. I do think that if we make the economic case, which we should make, that it's going to be cheaper for the consumers to shift to electricity, then I think we can use the networks. When I say utilities, it's the U.S. network companies, to really help facilitate and create that, effectively, that platform to allow for scale innovation. Because one of the things that we learned here, like with the NBN, right, in order to get broadband where we wanted, we needed a structural change in terms of getting everyone have universal access to broadband. I think utilities can play a very important role to say everyone should have universal access to electrification. For utilities, when I talk to the California utilities, who are quite concerned around how to react to the speed of adoption of EVs, the ability to say, well, our job now is to make sure there could be universal access to EVs and that we have the infrastructure and capability to accommodate it, actually makes it more efficient for them than having to be reactive. And I think we've learned this, too, on the big grid. The fact that we didn't do planning to accommodate renewables is why we have such queuing issues, not just here, but everywhere. If we actually plan for it, it'll be a lot more efficient.
It's kind of making sure you're solving for the right thing, right? And not solving for a problem that was defined 20 years ago, right? Bill, while Audrey and Amory confer,
I'm waiting for the solve the world's problem.
Oh, great. Amory, do you want to jump in?
Well, I was just going to invite Audrey to comment on the Sonnen business model in Australia. There are third parties that can finance, install, operate, maintain, say, a solar system, battery system, and just like using your car battery when it's parked to do transactions with the grid.
Yeah.
But there's a company in Zurich called the Mobility House that earns €1,000 per car per year by selling 13 kinds of ancillary services back to the grid. And it's not only energy swaps. and they have 8 more to go. Now, of course, that value will come down as the markets saturate, but there's still enormous value in grid car-house interactions, and third parties can organize that through business models such as are starting to emerge in Australia, and it's an enormous source of new value to not just make profit, but finance a lot of the transition.
Thank you for that. Let me add to it. So as we know, the concept of virtual power plants, which is really where we aggregate demand and shape it, is really critical. It's something that, for 2 reasons. One is because of the construction of the Australian grid. I mean, we can't forget we have the longest and skinniest grid in the world. And one of the things that we need to be thinking about is that while we have some geographic diversity, having flexibility on the system is going to be critical. And as Amory said, one of the best ways to get that flexibility is through demand. So when I was running AEMO, one of the things that we worried about when I started here in 2017 was peak load. By the time I left, I was equally or even more concerned about minimum load because of solar.
Yeah.
If we can create these dynamic operating envelopes, which is how we run the grid, we can value that on the system in aggregate. And companies, as I was saying, like SPAN are doing it in such a way that it's just your lowly electric panel that's optimizing and taking the signal. Has nothing, you don't, as an individual, you don't have to worry about it. And I think it's that sort of level of simplicity, but also the fact that now we can start accessing that, which is going to allow us to avoid having to build larger power plants, but also to drive better resiliency towards the system.
You also don't necessarily have to have a smart grid everywhere to do smart things on a dumb grid. For example, when I recharge my i3 electric car, the charger looks every second at the grid frequency and adjusts the charge rate according to whether the grid is short or long electricity. So I'm dispatching 7 kilowatts of fast grid regulation, a very valuable ancillary service, back to the Western Interconnect. And if they knew I was doing it and paid me what FERC says it's worth, I would earn an extra few dollars a day charging the grid off my rooftop solar, or charging the car.
By the way, I went to buy an i3. They're not making them anymore.
That's right, but they're good second-hand ones, and they don't rust. They'll be around a long time.
Can you two start a podcast? I'm really enjoying this. Bill, Race is doing a lot of thinking about kind of like the decision-making frameworks and sort of data that is available to decision makers to drive this transformation. Like, you know, the sorts of things we're talking about this morning, do we have the tools in the toolbox to do this, and how do we need to evolve them to make it happen?
Yeah, I think there's a few different things to unpack there. One, which is in, I guess, the tools themselves. The second is the decision making. So if I reflect back to 2011, so before I left the country, and we were going out and talking about the distributed PV that would come. And I say we, the CSIRO, where I worked at the time, and we were putting out this future vision that would see this coming. And it was pretty well crickets when we went out and talked to all the different stakeholders that were out there. So some of the tools were there, and we're doing some of the analysis. Now, were they as sophisticated as they should be? Absolutely not. And we are looking to do better things with those tools and to look to do particularly more within the distribution side of the fence to make sure that we better capture those effects and to sort of, I guess, lean in and build on the things that Audrey's just talked to provide better tools to allow decision makers to make better, more informed decisions. Some of that includes data, obviously, which Stephanie was talking to before. The fact that we don't have those data, you can have as many good models as you want without any basis to put those models in. Of course, you're never going to get the results that you want to see or desire. One of the other things that we're very strongly focused on, and I think it was building on Audrey's comments here, is really about the people themselves and how you integrate those societal outcomes within these decision-making models.
Yep.
That's a bit of cutting-edge science that a number of our researchers that are in the room are working on. It's actually things that sit behind real-world trials. So I was sitting over here with some colleagues from SAPN a moment ago, and we've just kick-started a big research program jointly funded between us and ARENA, really looking at and understanding some of those societal aspects, but also the technical aspects. And then the next stage is, how do we incorporate that into those broader long-term planning tools? And the more that we are able to do that and the better we're able to do it, the more we avoid the sorts of problems that we've talked to here about having a year to do this transition fast. You know, we should have been planning, thinking about, and not necessarily on the ground ready to run, but at least have had this thought and planning, you know, well before that sort of position. And we know with these transitions that these sorts of things will happen. I would just caution, and I do worry about when I hear, you know, large amounts of value that come from certain things, particularly in the first mover portions of it. The reason we need full systems models is to look at that full value chain, total value add. It's very easy to get caught up into, you know, I'm going to make quite a lot of money with my V2G service when there's only a small number of vehicles looking to do this. When I extrapolate that out to a very much larger sample, then of course those get much more muted, but still very valuable.
I think the question becomes, is driving efficiency through the system, right? And, but I have to say, we have made progress. When I was here, Ivor Frischnecht and I, who was then running ARENA, did a demand response trial, and I was accused of trying to throw Australia into a third world country. So there you go. I think we've changed a bit of the mindset.
We seem to be doing okay.
Yeah.
We'll go to the floor if there's any questions for our panel. We've got about 10 minutes before we need to break for afternoon tea. While you're all thinking, I just want to throw to you, because Stephanie, one of the things I think was very, you know, it's a Christchurch unity, I suppose. But just having that deadline.
Yeah,
right?
deadlines are very handy. Focuses the mind.
It does focus the mind. And I just thought, I just wondered if you could sort of reflect a little bit on that dynamic and kind of how that sort of changed the way that you approached the task. And then maybe I'm interested in the panel's thoughts on, you know, the utility of deadlines for this broader challenge that we've got in other parts of the country.
You know, I guess for Esperance, yes, we did have to focus the mind because we had customers who would have been without heating, cooling, hot water, for example, in a year. So deadlines are pretty helpful. They also, in the sense of the broader transition, they do help you with building a discussion around social licence a lot quicker than you might otherwise get there. You know, in the places that I serve, electric vehicles, for example, are things that are considered not likely to be there anytime soon, because the distances you've got to travel, for example, to get from Esperance to Perth are so far that you can't get your vehicle to a charger to even make that journey.
Yep.
Which means that you're going to have to trickle charge overnight, and so it's going to be a couple of days. I think that social licence is built a lot quicker when you have a real deadline, when there's something big hanging off the end of it. You know, having said that, people transition pretty late. I was very worried going into November, December that year, because many people will know it's almost impossible to get a trade in January. So it's very, very hard getting stuff done in Australia anywhere, let alone from a trade in January.
Yep.
So deadlines help, for sure.
Sounds like you need that Aptera car. The one model has a 1,600 kilometre range.
Yeah, it's going to be fantastic.
At night, and more in the daytime because it charges as it goes.
To me, that's enormously exciting. And as is the vehicle to grid. So, you know, we've just started a trial in Exmouth, which is another regional town, where we've gifted cars to try and help people see them. They're, you know, really high profile badging. But what we want to do is kind of prove that you can charge your house for 4 days from the car.
Yep.
Now, when you are worried about the power going out and some of the resiliency issues, if you've got that in your toolbox, that issue about sort of the chunky times, couple of days here and there when we don't have solar or wind, are really dramatically overcome. I can't wait to see that demonstrated.
Well, you told us a wonderful story, and I need to take it back to the States and show it to a lot of people. One of the many things we learned from Australia is you got really clever ways of organizing to do things. How do you think this would go in other communities, perhaps without the deadline? Based on what you've learned, can you set up a training program?
You know, what's one of the biggest issues in Australia right now? Cost of living. Now, when you demonstrate that you'll save $638 off your energy bill, and it's
twice what we got in the budget.
It's a striking. So every customer-focused group that we do research with across various organisations I'm connected with, it isn't so much the energy transition that's front of mind for people right now, it's their cost of living.
Yep.
So if you can show that there is a demonstrable hip pocket outcome here, that means that you can put food on the table, that you've got security in your home, I think that your incentive might be a lot stronger.
Have you thought about how to spread this around the country, not just WA?
Oh, we just come to places like this and chat about it. Yeah.
I think
Yeah, I mean, this is a great start, but
yeah.
there's a lot more.
There's a lot more.
But
yeah.
one of the things we can do, and which is, and policy, and this is where I think policy can create that sort of burning platform, as we used to say in the 90s, is the idea that, well, what if, and we did this, right, with the renewable targets. We set targets. And what if we start setting electrification targets?
Yep.
And that seems, government-created demand seems to be a really efficient way to create that platform, and then regulated entities or the retailers
Yep.
could respond.
Make sure
The
there's
run,
no disincentives.
Yeah.
the run rate for electrification is incredibly important. And
That's right.
And also important when you're thinking about scaling up the industry and the supply chains and the trades to do that work. And I think that's where you start,
And
right?
that becomes that system thinking. If we know where the destination is,
Yep.
then we can pull it together.
I'm wondering if your trades can start making videos to show to their peers around the country.
Absolutely. I
I
can
think
see.
Social media.
I feel like poor Luke is feeling like
No.
he's...
I'm enjoying there being more,
Yeah.
like three or
gonna
four
say
hosts
that
of this
the,
panel right now.
I mean, obviously one of the things that Race, one of the things that Arena and others tried to do is really build on that knowledge sharing component. I would reflect that I've seen issues where people see that as too onerous and not wanting to do trials for that reason because of that. But there is such a value to be gained from learning from the experiences that you've done here. This is one version of a knowledge sharing platform, but that's actually part of. I think that's as critical as setting some of these deadlines. For instance, the deadlines maybe are, doing more of the innovation trials and sharing, getting that out there as not being artificial. And to be able to help on some of that decision making and see the real value and share those lessons. Because you do brilliant work, say, in WA, but does that really reflect across, to the eastern states as well as it should?
So-
Similarly for the work, say, of South Australia.
Yeah, so I think it's very location specific and it's very community specific, and you've got to, like, in terms of the benefits, and that you can't just tell people, they've got to experience it, right? Whether it's their neighbours or family members or people that they're catching up with at the footy club. We will go to a question. There's a question down here, and there's a question. Oh, there's questions all over the place. We've just been very excited up here. Sorry about that. Do we have a microphone? Over here first, Jens. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to the panel. Very memorable talks this morning. Another memorable talk was about 10 years ago. Dagmar Gracik from the International Energy Agency was talking about the multiple benefits of energy efficiency. Back then, this conference was called the Energy Efficiency Conference. It's not called that anymore for good reasons. It's about more than just energy efficiency. There's fuel switching, electrification, decarbonization. It does feel like the focus on energy efficiency is waning a little bit. And it would be great to hear from the whole panel, but maybe in the interest of time, I might ask Professor Lovend, do you think there's a risk, and insofar you can talk about the Australian context, of forgetting about energy efficiency with too much focus on electrification and fuel switching?
Yeah, they're both important, but I think it is fair to say that attention to efficiency has waned in the past decade. It's coming back now, especially with the triple up, double down agreement. My own organization was partly responsible for that waning, because we happened to have a leader at the time who paid a great deal of attention to supply. We did excellent work on supply, but somehow efficiency got less attention, and now we're rebuilding that. And I think that's been true of a lot of organizations that figured that its merits are so obvious, we don't need to do much. And indeed, that turned out to be wrong. We're now recovering.
I would just add that that's the absolute rationale as to why we're looking at these whole of system approaches.
Yes.
So.
And the other thing I'd add is we've got to do them together. Like all those different approaches need to be integrated. We've got a question just here. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you to the panel this morning. It's been an excellent discussion and podcast episode. You've been amazing. Given the title of this morning's session is Australia's role in the global transformation, from where you sit, do you see Australia as a leader or a laggard? Are there certain sectors?
Both.
Both.
Yeah.
Just your comments on that.
And Audrey, you?
Yeah, I think, well, there's aspects of Australia that are truly leading. So one of the things that is around this construct of a dynamic operating envelope. And the fact that we should be running the power system when we think about it, not just when I think about shedding solar or shedding load, but actually treating the distribution system as in a very dynamic way so that we modulate demand. I think that piece, even that verbiage, is being picked up now in the US as a new way of operating the system. The other area where I think Australia is leading is some of the tech that's been developed here. Companies like Line Vision that came out of Australia, other companies like, I'm going to forget some of their names, but some of the system modeling tools that are taking off. So I think Australia is leading in a lot of ways that people aren't even aware of, where a lot of the technologies, software and hardware technologies that we've piloted here are moving around the world. And so sort of the way of doing business, as well, the way of running the grid, I would say. And then most recently, yesterday, FERC, the US, finally adopted a set of planning rules that mirror very much some of the work that we've been doing around the creation of renewable energy zones. So I feel like, I'm a big, obviously, booster of what Australians done. And I think the area that we're probably not moving fast enough in, and I've been saying that for a really long time, is the market design. We're still stuck in the 90s, and we need to move it a little bit
But
forward.
don't forget the rooftop solar revolution. I mean,
Was here,
several
yeah.
years ago, RMI sent a delegation here to figure out how do you do it at half our price,
Yeah.
even though we're all buying the same materials in the world market.
Okay, we've got a question up the back here. If this is about nuclear...
No, I won't go there.
Although I think Emery's slides are going to be somewhere in a newspaper tomorrow.
there may have been a text message to Chris Bell.
We'll try and make sure that's the case, yeah. Murray Hogarth from the Fifth Estate, but I'm also working on a project with the university for infrastructure for the energy transition, and part of that is disinformation and misinformation. And I guess this is a question for the double A's, Audrey and Amory. Do you see a orchestrated campaign of disinformation against the energy transition, and do you see that being connected between the US and Australia?
Yes and yes.
Yes, and what I'm more concerned about too is disinformation, misinformation, lack of information. But in the U.S. now, people are really concerned about the fact that if it changed administration, I won't tell you how I feel about that, if the potential and then a real change in policy, it really stymies investment just when we need it. And so I think what's more important than anything is the ability to have policy that is no longer associated with identity politics. And that should be, hopefully, we get there
That's
now.
a huge issue.
I think that's ultimately going to be fed from the trusted agents, and so we represent universities, CSIRO, others like that have that strong capability in Australia. And we see, as Stephanie pointed out, just electricians, for instance, with the strong role that they have in making these happen and dispelling some of those myths.
There's a little pocket of questions over here. James, if you can...
I'm Judith Friedman. I work for Sydney Trains, and we look on the infrastructure. So we constantly do this. What I can see with other government departments I work with, they don't look at their infrastructure and how they move their grid systems internally. So, and that's in New South Wales, but I've also worked in Queensland and other places on this. But in Australia, we are forward-thinking, because I've seen a world of things. But the factor is we've got to look at each state differently and how progressive they are. Some of them are 50 years behind, some are 20 years and not coming up to across-the-board standards. If we all were working on the same standards and the outcomes, then we're more progressed than what we are today. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I might take that as a comment. There's
Yes.
there's one more question just up the back, and then that will be our last question.
Hi, I'm Helen Oakey from Renew. We're a small community organisation that's run for nearly 45 years, looking at how to get householders to transition. I was really interested, Stephanie, in your story about how challenging that was for 400 people and how in-depth that consultation, that kind of community engagement needs to be to take people on that journey. And particularly conscious that the people that we want to take on that journey are often the hardest to reach. They need convincing, they need to hear it from certain people. How do you see that as being an obstacle going forward for this transition, given that we obviously can't do 400 at a time? And do you have any great ideas about how we chip away at that?
Yep.
And I guess the other bigger picture question is, how big do you think that resistance is going to be to slowing that transition down?
Yeah, look, I think one of the huge takeaways for us was that the level of customer engagement was far more significant than we thought. We thought we could attack this via media campaigns and community events, and it became very one-on-one. So that was a great takeaway. We also have a really great, penetration into each of our communities, because we've got depots in every one of our communities around the state, and I don't for a moment pretend that you can do that on scale in somewhere like Victoria or New South Wales. I do think, sort of going back to Bill's comment about the trades, for example, we have found that the single biggest supporter of our business now, in contrast to where it has been when we kind of put our foot on the hose for hosting capacity constraints, i.e. saying you can't put solar on because our system won't cope. Every time we remove that, and we've now done that progressively around every one of our systems in WA, and we're tiny, small microgrids, so big changes make a big impact. It was the solar installers. And so I think you've actually got to engage very different groups of customers, and beyond the customers, you've got to get into the trades. And then I think you've actually got to get in, it's a hearts and minds winning of the battle. And we haven't even begun to address, equity in the rooftops, as I call it, which is if you are a renter and your landlord isn't kind of going down this path because there isn't an incentive for them to do so, you're really shut out of the energy transition. In many of our communities, 70% of our customers are renting, and many of those are in social housing. Now, we can tackle social housing through government policy, and we can, for example, have it mandated that every social house that has a structure that can support it or have solar. But I think there has to be ways to address that through, and there's not, one silver bullet for this. So I'd say building efficiency is an enormously successful way of doing it if you can create a standard that requires your dwelling to have certain aspects to it. So to Audrey's point right at the beginning, this sort of universal right to electrification and efficiency, to take the comment from the floor. If you have an efficient building and you have a right to electrification and it's enshrined in building standards and other policy levers, I think you can make huge headway much more quickly than by a more
Moral persuasion.
Yeah, that's right.
I hope there's public servants in the audience taking notes. That's all I can say. We're out of time. Stephanie, thanks so much for coming over from WA. Bill, pleasure as always. Audrey, Amory, looking to the AA Energy Transition Podcast.
I like this.
Coming to a podcast feed near you. Please put your hands together for our panel.